"You don't belong here, sir." The words landed cold, flat, practiced, like they'd been said 100 times before to 100 different men. But something about the way they echoed across the open field made heads turn, just slightly, just enough to notice, as Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the graduation bleachers, his hand tightening around the folded program he'd been holding for the last 20 minutes. The paper creasing under his grip while the late afternoon sun burned down at 82 degrees, reflecting off rows of polished chairs and bright blue gowns. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixing with the faint scent of sunscreen and anticipation. And for a moment, just a moment, he didn't respond, didn't move, just looked past the officer's shoulder toward the stage where his son stood somewhere in that sea of caps and tassels, waiting for his name to be called, waiting for a face in the crowd that had never once missed anything important. Not a game, not a parent-teacher meeting, not a single milestone, until... Now the officer stepped closer, his radio crackling softly against his chest, a subtle shift in posture that wasn't aggressive but carried authority all the same. "I'm going to need you to step away from this section," he added, voice firmer this time, quieter but sharper, like a line being drawn without needing to be seen, and Marcus blinked slowly, as if pulling himself back into the moment. The sound of applause somewhere in the distance rising and falling like waves, names being called over. The loudspeaker that he couldn't quite make out anymore, his focus narrowing, shrinking, until it was just him, the officer, and the invisible wall between them. "There must be a mistake," Marcus said finally, his voice calm. Even, the kind of calm that didn't come from comfort, but from years of learning when not to escalate, when to hold the line quietly instead of loudly, his eyes steady but not confrontational. "My son's graduating today," he added, almost as if that alone should be enough. Should mean something, should open a door instead of closing one, but the officer didn't react the way Marcus had hoped, didn't soften, didn't reconsider, just glanced briefly at a clipboard tucked under his arm before shaking his head slightly. "This section is reserved," he said, the word reserved hanging heavier than it should have, as if it carried more meaning than seating arrangements. "If your name's not on the list, you can't stay here." And there it was, simple, procedural, final, the kind of rule that didn't leave room for explanation or memory or sacrifice. Just a line on a page somewhere that said who belonged and who didn't. Marcus lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second, just enough to notice the edge of his own reflection in the polished metal pin to his chest, the metal catching the sunlight, dull from years of wear, but still intact, still present, a quiet piece of a life that most people here would never see, never ask about, never understand. And as he lifted his eyes again, the cheers swelled louder from the stage, a name called, a family celebrating, cameras flashing, a moment happening that he was dangerously close to missing. And still, he didn't move. Not yet. Not until he saw something shift in the distance, subtle at first, barely noticeable, a ripple in the crowd behind him, the kind of movement that didn't belong to celebration but to attention, like something, or someone, had just decided to step forward. The ripple behind Marcus did not come with noise at first, just a subtle shift in posture from a few people standing near the back rows, shoulders straightening, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, eyes turning toward the same point as if something unseen had just entered the space, and Marcus felt it before he fully saw it. That quiet change in air pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks, but softer, more controlled, the kind of presence that did not need volume to be noticed. The officer in front of him hesitated for half a second, barely perceptible, his gaze flicking past Marcus's shoulder before returning, tightening slightly, recalibrating, as if something in his mental checklist no longer aligned the way it had just moments ago. "Sir, I need you to cooperate," he said again, but the edge in his voice had shifted, less certain now, less absolute, and Marcus caught that, not with triumph. Not even with hope, just awareness, the kind that comes from years of reading rooms where words were never the full story. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest settling into something steadier, something grounded, and for the first time since being stopped, he allowed himself to turn his head slightly, just enough to see what had changed. 6 figures moved through the crowd with deliberate calm, not pushing, not rushing, just walking in a line that parted the space naturally, people stepping aside without being asked, without understanding exactly why, But sensing that they should, their uniforms were crisp, formal, decorated in a way that spoke without explanation, and though no one announced them, no one needed to, there was a quiet recognition in the way older veterans in the audience straightened in their seats. In the way a man near the aisle removed his cap and held it against his chest without realizing he had done it. Marcus's eyes lingered on them for a fraction. Longer than necessary, not in disbelief, not in surprise, but in something deeper, something quieter, like recognition layered over memory. His fingers loosened around the folded program, the paper relaxing back into shape as if mirroring the shift in his breathing. The officer noticed it too. The approach, the alignment, the unspoken gravity of 6 men who did not need to raise their voices to change the direction of a moment. His stance adjusted instinctively, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting slightly as if preparing to reassert control, but the timing no longer belonged to him. The first of the 6 men stopped a few feet behind Marcus, close enough to be felt, not close enough to crowd. And for a heartbeat, no one spoke. The graduation ceremony continued in the background, a name called, applause rising, a family cheering somewhere to the left, but here, in this narrow space between rows of bleachers, everything slowed again, stretched thin across seconds that felt longer than they should have. Marcus did not turn fully, did not acknowledge them directly, but his posture shifted just enough, a subtle straightening of his back, a quiet reclaiming of space that had been taken from him minutes earlier, and the officer saw it, felt it, the change in balance, the way this was no longer a simple enforcement of rules, but something more complicated, something layered, something he had not anticipated when he first walked over. "Is there a problem here?" A voice asked from behind Marcus, calm, measured, carrying across the space without force, and the words did not sound like a challenge, did not sound like confrontation, but they landed heavier than either, because they carried weight that did not need explanation. And for the first time since this began, the officer did not answer immediately. The silence after the question stretched just long enough to be felt, not just heard, like a held breath that no one wanted to release first. And the officer cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly as he glanced from Marcus to the men behind him, recalculating in real time. "This is a restricted seating area," he said, choosing his words carefully now, no longer as firm as before, more measured, more aware of the audience that had quietly gathered around them. "I am just following protocol." And the man behind Marcus stepped forward half a pace, not enough to invade space, just enough to be seen clearly, his uniform catching the sunlight in sharp, clean lines, ribbons aligned with precision, his presence calm but unmistakable. "Protocol matters," he said evenly, his voice low but carrying, "but context matters more." And that word context seemed to hang in the air, heavier than expected, pulling attention from nearby rows where parents had begun to notice the stillness, the shift, the absence of applause in this small corner of the field. Marcus remained still, his gaze forward, but his breathing had changed, slower now, steadier, as if something inside him had settled into place. Not relief, not yet, but recognition. The officer hesitated again, his fingers adjusting the edge of his clipboard, eyes scanning the names as if the answer might suddenly appear there, something to justify the moment, something to restore control, but the list remained unchanged, and the situation no longer fit neatly inside it. "Sir," the officer began, addressing Marcus again, but his tone had softened, the authority still there but no longer absolute. "If you could just step back a few rows, we can resolve this without disruption." And the suggestion sounded almost reasonable, almost harmless, but the man behind Marcus shook his head slightly before Marcus could respond. A small movement, controlled, deliberate. "He is exactly where he is supposed to be," he said. And this time there was no explanation attached, no elaboration, just a statement that carried its own weight. Marcus's hand moved slowly to his chest, fingers brushing against the edge of his metal, not adjusting it, just touching it, grounding himself in something that had never required permission, never required validation. And for a brief second, his eyes closed, not in defeat, not in frustration, but in memory, flashes that did not need to be seen to be understood, long nights, distant places, decisions made under pressure, the kind of moments that never appeared on any list but defined everything that came after. The ceremony continued in the background. Another name called, applause rising again. But closer now. People were no longer looking away. They were watching, quietly, curiously, sensing that something important was unfolding without fully knowing why. The officer noticed it too. The attention, the shift in perception, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his expression, subtle but real, because this was no longer just about a seating section, no longer just about a name on a page, and the man behind Marcus took one more step forward, now fully beside him, close enough that their shoulders aligned, equal in presence, equal in stillness, and he turned his head slightly toward the officer, his voice calm, almost conversational, but carrying a quiet finality that did not invite argument. "Do you know who he is?" he asked, and the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like an invitation to see something that had been overlooked from the very beginning, and the officer, for the first time, had no immediate answer. The question did not demand an answer, but it left no room to hide from one, and the officer's gaze shifted. Again, this time not to the clipboard, not to the crowd, but directly to Marcus, really looking at him for the first time, not just the uniform, not just the presence, but the details that had been easy to overlook before, the faint lines etched into his face, the stillness in his posture, the way his hands did not fidget, did not tremble, just rested with quiet control, and something in that stillness began to feel familiar, not personally, but professionally, like a pattern he had seen before, but could not immediately place. "He is a parent at this event," the officer said finally, choosing a safer answer, one that stayed within the boundaries of what he could confirm. But the man beside Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the limitation of that answer. "He is that," he said calmly. "But that is not all he is," and the distinction landed with weight. Not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. Marcus remained silent, his eyes forward, but his breathing slowed even further, each inhale measured, each exhale steady, as if he had stepped into a space where he no longer needed to explain himself, no longer needed to justify his presence. And the man beside him continued, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, without turning the moment into a spectacle. 20 years in service, he said, not looking at Marcus, not asking for confirmation, just stating it as fact. Multiple deployments, leadership under pressure, the kind that does not get written into programs or printed on guest lists. And the officer's expression shifted again, this time more visibly, the certainty that had anchored him earlier beginning to loosen, replaced by something more complex, something that did not fit into procedure alone. A pause stretched between them, not tense, not hostile, just heavy with information that had not been considered before. And behind them, the other 5 men stood in quiet alignment, not speaking, not moving, their presence alone reinforcing what had been said without needing repetition. The crowd nearby had grown still, conversations fading into silence as more people began to notice, not the specifics, but the gravity, the way the moment carried itself differently now. And Marcus's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of his medal again, not for display, not for recognition, just a quiet habit, a grounding point. And for a brief second, his gaze dropped to it, the sunlight catching its worn surface, reflecting a muted glint that did not demand attention but held history within it. And when he lifted his eyes again, they were steady, calm, unchanged, as if nothing outside of this moment had ever been in question. The officer swallowed subtly, his posture adjusting once more, less rigid now, less certain. "I was not made aware," he said, almost to himself, the words quieter, less official, and the man beside Marcus gave a slight nod, not dismissive, not critical, just acknowledging the gap. "That is often the case," he replied, his tone even. "But not being aware does not change what is true." And the simplicity of that statement seemed to settle into the space around them, clear, unavoidable. And for the first time since this began, the officer did not reach for his clipboard, did not reference the list, did not repeat protocol. Instead, he looked at Marcus again, really looked, and the question that had been asked moments ago lingered in the air, unanswered but no longer ignored. And somewhere in the distance, Ethan's name began to form over the loudspeaker. the first syllable rising into the air as the moment reached its quiet edge, suspended. Between what had been enforced and what was about to be understood, the first syllable of Ethan's name hung in the air like a spark, stretching across the field as if time itself had slowed to make room for it. And Marcus's head lifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in instinct, the kind that never fades no matter how many years pass. His eyes locking onto the stage where his son stepped forward, shoulders squared, diploma waiting just a few steps ahead, and for a brief second, everything else faded. The officer, the crowd, the tension, all of it dissolving into the simple, undeniable truth of that moment. His son was about to cross a line he had worked for his entire life, and Marcus was dangerously close to missing it. The officer followed Marcus's gaze, turning just enough to see the young man on stage, the name now fully spoken over the loudspeaker. Applause beginning to rise again, scattered at first, then building, and something in that sound shifted the balance further, because this was no longer abstract, no longer procedural. This was real, immediate, human, and the officer's grip on the situation loosened without him fully realizing it, his hand dropping from the clipboard to his side. The rigid structure he had relied on moments ago no longer fitting the weight of what was happening in front of him. The man beside Marcus noticed it too. The shift, the quiet unraveling of certainty, and he spoke again, softer this time, not for the crowd, not even for Marcus, but directly to the officer. He has earned this moment, he said, each word measured, steady, not just as a father, but as someone who has stood where most people here never will. And there was no accusation in his tone, no anger, just a calm statement of fact that left no space for dismissal. Marcus took a slow step forward, not pushing past, not forcing anything, just moving with quiet intention. And this time, the officer did not stop him, did not raise a hand, did not repeat protocol. He simply watched, the decision forming not in words but in the absence of resistance. And as Marcus stepped into the row, finding an open seat just as Ethan reached the edge of the stage, the applause swelled fully. Now, louder, fuller, carrying across the field in a wave that felt different from the ones before. Because this one carried something more than celebration. It carried recognition. Even if most people did not fully understand why. Marcus sat down slowly, his posture straight but relaxed, his eyes never leaving his son. And when Ethan's hand closed around the diploma, when he turned slightly toward the crowd, searching, scanning, hoping, their eyes met, just for a second, but it was enough, more than enough. And in that silent exchange, everything that had almost been taken away settled back into place, steady, unshaken, real. Behind him, the 6 men remained standing, not drawing attention, not seeking acknowledgement, just present. Their stillness a quiet line that no longer needed to be defended. And the officer stepped back half a pace, then another, the space he had controlled moments ago now returning to something more natural, more human, his gaze lingering on Marcus for a second longer before dropping slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding. And as the next name began to echo over the loudspeaker, the moment closed not with confrontation, not with victory, but with something quieter, something deeper, the kind of shift that does not need to be announced to be real. The applause lingered a second longer than usual, as if the crowd itself was reluctant to let the moment pass, and Marcus sat there with his hands resting lightly on his knees, the folded program now open but forgotten, his eyes still fixed on Ethan as he stepped off the stage, diploma held carefully in both hands like something fragile, something earned. And for a brief moment, the noise around them softened again, not completely silent, but distant, like everything had shifted a few feet away from where it mattered most. And Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding far longer than he realized, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension easing not all at once, but in layers, like something unwinding inside him that had been pulled tight since the first word spoken at the entrance. Behind him, the 6 men remained where they were, their posture unchanged, their presence steady, not drawing attention yet impossible to ignore. And one of them, the same man who had spoken before, turned his head just enough to glance at Marcus, not checking on him, not asking anything, just acknowledging, a quiet understanding passing between them without the need for words. Marcus gave the smallest nod in return, almost imperceptible, a gesture that carried more weight than anything spoken so far. And then his attention returned forward, where Ethan had paused near the edge of the stage, scanning the crowd again. This time slower, more deliberate, as if confirming what he had seen just moments ago was real. And when their eyes met again, Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically. Not in a way that would draw attention from others, but enough, a subtle lift in his shoulders, a steadiness in his stance, the kind that comes from knowing someone is there, truly there. And the ceremony moved on, name after name called, applause rising and falling in steady rhythm. But something had changed in this small section of the bleachers. People no longer looked away quickly, no longer avoided the space where Marcus sat. Instead, a few glanced over, quietly, respectfully, some with curiosity, others with something closer to recognition, as if they had witnessed something they did not fully understand but knew mattered. The officer stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center of anything, his clipboard lowered at his side, his posture less rigid. And for a moment, he looked at Marcus again, then at the men behind him, then back toward the stage, his expression thoughtful, unsettled in a way that was not discomfort but reflection, like something had shifted inside him that he had not expected when he first approached. And he adjusted his stance slightly, no longer guarding a boundary, but observing a moment, and the sunlight began to dip lower, casting longer shadows across the field, the bright blue of the gowns softening into deeper tones, the air cooling just slightly from the earlier heat. And Marcus noticed it in small ways. The way the breeze moved across the rows, the way the sound carried differently now, clearer somehow, and his fingers brushed the edge of his metal again, not out of habit this time, but awareness, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had brought him here, everything that had almost been taken from him just minutes ago, and everything that remained, intact, unshaken, real. And as Ethan made his way down from the stage, weaving through the line of graduates, one hand holding the diploma, the other adjusting the edge of his cap, he did not rush, did not break formation, but there was a subtle urgency in his steps, a quiet pull drawing him toward the section where Marcus now sat, and the space between them began to close, slowly, steadily, with each step carrying the weight of something far greater than the ceremony itself. Ethan stepped off the last riser with care, the edge of his gown brushing against his legs as he moved, the diploma still held in both hands, but his attention no longer on the stage behind him, not on the principal, not on the line of graduates forming for the final photo, but forward, fixed, steady, drawn by something that mattered more than the ceremony itself. And each step he took felt heavier, not from doubt, but from meaning, from the quiet realization of how close he had come to walking that stage without the one person who had carried him there long before this day ever arrived. And Marcus saw it, not just the movement, but the intent behind it, the way Ethan's shoulders leaned slightly forward, the way his pace was measured but purposeful. And Marcus did not stand immediately, did not wave, did not call out. He simply watched, his hands now resting against the edges of his seat, grounding himself in the moment, letting it come to him without forcing it, because he had learned that some moments were not meant to be rushed. They were meant to be received, fully, completely, without interruption. And around them, the ceremony continued, names echoing over the speakers, applause rising in waves that felt almost distant now, like background noise to something far more personal unfolding just a few rows in. The 6 men behind Marcus remained still, but one of them shifted slightly, stepping half a pace back as if to create space, not physically necessary, but symbolically precise, making room for something that did not belong to them, something that belonged to a father and a son. And the officer watched it all, his gaze following Ethan's path, his expression no longer guarded, no longer fixed on control, but open, attentive, as if he too was witnessing something that required nothing from him except presence. And Ethan reached the bottom of the bleachers, his shoes hitting the concrete with a soft, steady rhythm, the sound barely audible but grounding, real. And when he looked up again, the distance between them had closed enough that there was no mistaking it, no uncertainty left. Marcus was there, exactly where he was supposed to be, exactly where Ethan had hoped he would be. And something in Ethan's face shifted, subtle but undeniable, a release of tension that had been hidden beneath composure, a quiet exhale that softened the line of his jaw. and Marcus stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just rising to meet him, his posture straight, his presence calm, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. No words, no gestures, just recognition. The kind that does not need explanation because it has been built over years of shared moments, shared sacrifices, shared silence. And Ethan stepped forward the last few feet, closing the space completely, the diploma now held in one hand as the other reached out. Not rushed, not uncertain, just sure. And Marcus met it, his hand firm, steady, the contact brief but grounding, before Ethan pulled him into a quiet embrace, not tight, not dramatic, just enough. Enough to say everything that words could not carry in that moment. And Marcus's hand rested lightly on Ethan's back, his grip gentle but certain, and the world around them did not stop, did not pause, but it felt like it had, just for a second, just long enough for this to exist without interruption, and behind them, the six men remained where they were, silent, still, their presence no longer a barrier, no longer a line, but a witness, and the officer lowered his gaze slightly, not in avoidance, but in respect, as if understanding now that some moments are not meant to be managed, they are meant to be allowed. And as Ethan stepped back, lifting the diploma slightly, a small, proud gesture, Marcus nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried more than pride, more than relief. It carried something deeper, something earned, something that had never needed permission to exist. And the light shifted again as the sun dipped lower, casting a warmer glow across the field, softening the edges of everything. And for the first time since the moment began, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. Only the quiet, undeniable presence of what had always been true. The embrace lingered for just a second longer than expected, not out of hesitation, but because neither of them seemed ready to let the moment fully pass. And when they stepped back, the air between them felt different, lighter somehow, as if something that had been quietly pressing down had finally lifted, and Ethan let out a small breath he did not realize he had been holding, his fingers adjusting the edge of his diploma, almost absently, as he looked at Marcus again, really looked this time, taking in every detail he might have missed from the stage, the lines on his face, the stillness in his eyes, the metal catching, the warm light of the late afternoon sun. And there was something in that look that carried more than pride, more than relief. It carried understanding, the kind that comes not from a single moment, but from years that suddenly make sense all at once. And Marcus saw it, not as a revelation, but as something quietly acknowledged, something that had always been there waiting to be seen. And he gave a slight nod, not instructing, not guiding, just affirming, as if to say this moment belongs to you. Fully, completely, without interruption. And Ethan nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before turning slightly, glancing over his shoulder toward the stage where the ceremony continued, the line of graduates moving forward in steady rhythm. And for a second, he hesitated, caught between staying and returning, between holding on to this moment and stepping back into the one he had just come from. And Marcus noticed it immediately, the pause, the weight of choice in something so simple. And he lifted his hand just slightly, not to stop him, not to pull him back, but to release him, a quiet gesture that said, "Go finish what you started. I am here. I am not going anywhere." And that was enough. Ethan straightened, the uncertainty gone as quickly as it had appeared, and he stepped back, one pace, then another, before turning fully and moving toward the stage again, his steps lighter now, more certain, as if something inside him had realigned, and the distance between them grew again. But it no longer felt like separation. It felt like continuation, like part of a larger line that connected them beyond this moment. Behind Marcus, the six men shifted slightly, not in formation, not in unison, just a natural easing of posture now that the tension had passed, and one of them exhaled quietly, almost like a release, before adjusting his stance, his eyes briefly following Ethan's return to the line, and the officer remained a few steps back, his presence still but changed, no longer a figure of control, no longer a barrier, just another person standing within the moment, observing it unfold. And he glanced once more at Marcus, his expression thoughtful, as if trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he had assumed earlier. And for a brief second, their eyes met, not confrontational, not defensive, just aware, and the officer gave a small nod, subtle, almost instinctive, before looking away, not out of discomfort, but acknowledgement, and Marcus returned his gaze forward, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as the ceremony moved toward its final stretch. The names growing fewer, the applause more continuous, the energy shifting from anticipation to completion, and the sunlight dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the field, softening the edges of everything it touched, and Marcus noticed the warmth on his hands, the quiet movement of air across his face, the distant sound of laughter from somewhere beyond the bleachers. And it all felt sharper now, clearer, like the world had come back into focus after a moment of tension. And when Ethan reached his place in line again, he turned just once more, a quick glance, brief but certain. And Marcus was still there, exactly where he had been, exactly where he was meant to be. And that was enough to carry the rest of the moment forward. The final names began to echo across the field with a different tone now, less spaced, more continuous, as if the ceremony itself was leaning toward its conclusion, and Ethan stood back in line, shoulders relaxed but upright, his diploma held at his side instead of clutched, his breathing even, steady, while his gaze moved forward again, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, just present, fully anchored in where he stood, and Marcus watched it all from his seat, his hands resting calmly, fingers lightly interlaced now, the tension from earlier, replaced by something quieter, something grounded, and he allowed himself, for the first time since arriving, to look around, not in vigilance, not in anticipation, but in awareness, the rows of parents, the scattered smiles, the subtle glances that still came his way, not intrusive, not questioning, just respectful in a way that did not need explanation. And behind him, the 6 men had eased further, their stance no longer aligned in quiet formation, but natural now, one adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, another glancing toward the stage, their presence still strong but no longer a line drawn in the moment, more like a quiet echo of what had already been resolved. And the officer shifted his weight again, taking a step to the side, then another, placing himself just outside the center of the scene entirely, his clipboard now tucked under his arm, and used, unnecessary, and he glanced once more at Marcus, his expression no longer searching for answers, but holding onto the ones he had already found, even if he could not yet fully name them. And the loudspeaker carried another name, then another, the applause blending together into a steady rhythm that felt less like individual celebration and more like a collective closing. And Marcus's eyes returned to Ethan just as the line of graduates began to shift again, turning, preparing for the final procession, the moment where they would move together, unified, toward the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And Ethan adjusted his cap slightly, the tassel brushing against his temple as he moved, his posture confident, his steps measured, and as he began to walk with the others, he did not look back immediately, not out of distance, but out of trust, the kind that did not require constant confirmation, because he already knew Marcus was there, still there, exactly where he had been when it mattered most, and that certainty carried him forward, step by step, while Marcus remained seated, his gaze following, steady and unwavering, the kind of presence that did not need to call out to be felt. And the sunlight dipped lower still, casting long shadows across the field, the warmth softening into something cooler, more reflective, and the air shifted with it, a gentle breeze moving through the rows, lifting the edges of programs, brushing lightly against shoulders, carrying with it the quiet sense that something meaningful had passed through this place, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would linger long after the chairs were folded and the field cleared. And as the final group of graduates moved into position, the ceremony drawing toward its last moments, Marcus leaned back slightly, just enough to settle into the seat beneath him, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing even, his presence no longer defined by what had almost happened, but by what remained undeniable. And behind him, one of the men spoke softly, barely above a whisper, not meant for the crowd, not even fully meant for Marcus, but it carried anyway. He did not need us. And another voice responded just as quietly, no, but sometimes the moment does. And Marcus heard it, not turning, not reacting outwardly, just absorbing it, letting it settle where it belonged, somewhere deeper than acknowledgement, somewhere closer to truth. And as the final applause began to rise once more, fuller, longer, marking the end of the ceremony, the moment did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like something opening, something that had been there all along, now finally seen clearly in the light. The final applause rose and held, not in short bursts like before, but in a long, continuous wave that rolled across the field, filling the space with a sound that felt fuller, deeper, as if everyone understood that something more than a ceremony had just concluded. And Marcus remained seated for a moment longer than most, his hands resting loosely, his gaze still forward as the graduates shifted into their final formation, blue gowns moving together like a single current, and Ethan stood among them, no longer searching, no longer scanning, just present, his posture calm, his place certain. And Marcus let that image settle, memorizing it without effort, the way a man remembers something he knows he will return to long after the moment is gone. And slowly, he rose, not rushed, not delayed, just in time with the natural movement around him, people beginning to stand, to gather their things, to turn toward the aisles, the hum of voices returning in layers, soft at first, then growing, conversations overlapping, laughter breaking through the air. And behind him, the 6 men shifted as well, not as a unit, not with intention, just naturally, like the end of something that had already served its purpose. And one of them stepped closer to Marcus, just enough to be heard without drawing attention. "You stayed steady," he said quietly, not as praise, not as surprise, just acknowledgement. And Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze for a brief second, his expression calm, grounded. "It was never about standing out," Marcus replied, his voice low, even. "It was about being there." And the man gave a small nod, understanding without needing more, before stepping back again, allowing the moment to close without extending it. And the officer remained near the aisle, watching the crowd begin to move, his posture no longer fixed in place, no longer tied to a single role. And as Marcus stepped toward the aisle, their paths aligned briefly, not by design, just by movement. And the officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking, his voice quieter now, stripped of formality. "Sir," he said. And Marcus paused, turning just enough to face him, not defensive, not guarded, just present. And the officer held his gaze for a moment, searching for the right words, but finding none that fully fit. And so he settled on something simpler, something honest. "I should have asked first," he said, the admission soft, but clear. And Marcus looked at him, not with judgment, not with distance, just with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning. And after a brief pause, he nodded once, a small, measured acknowledgement that did not erase what had happened, but did not hold on to it either. And without another word, he continued forward, stepping into the flow of people moving toward the exit, the sunlight now lower, casting a warm glow across the field, the air cooler, softer. And as he reached the edge of the bleachers, Ethan's voice cut through the noise, clear, familiar. "Dad?" And Marcus turned, just in time to see him approaching through the crowd, diploma in hand, a small, proud smile forming. And in that moment, everything else faded again, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer mattered. And Marcus stepped forward to meet him, not as someone who had just been challenged, not as someone who had just been defended, but simply as a father who had made it to where he was always meant to be, exactly when it mattered most. "Dad." The word carried differently this time, not just a call across distance, but something fuller, something anchored in everything that had almost been lost just minutes earlier. And Marcus turned completely now, stepping forward as Ethan closed the final few feet between them, the crowd moving around them in soft currents, voices rising and blending into a steady hum that faded the moment they stood face to face again. And Ethan let out a breath that turned into a quiet laugh, the kind that comes when tension finally releases, when something heavy lifts without warning. And he held up the diploma slightly, not as a show, not as a gesture for anyone else, but for Marcus. "I got it," he said, simple, direct, but the meaning behind it stretched far beyond the paper in his hand. And Marcus nodded, his eyes steady, taking in the moment fully. "I know," he replied, his voice low, calm, but carrying a quiet certainty that made the words feel grounded, real. And Ethan studied his face for a second longer, as if confirming something deeper than presence, as if measuring the distance between what could have happened and what did. And then he shook his head slightly, a faint smile forming. "I thought for a second," he began, but the sentence trailed off, unfinished, because it did not need to be completed. The weight of it already understood, and Marcus met that unfinished thought with a small nod, acknowledging it without giving it more space than it deserved. "You did not have to," he said, not dismissing the feeling, just placing it where it belonged, behind them, and Ethan exhaled again, softer this time, the last of the tension leaving his shoulders as he adjusted his grip on the diploma, the paper, catching the warm light. And for a moment, they simply stood there, not speaking, not moving, just existing in the quiet space they had reclaimed. And around them, the field continued to empty slowly, rows of chairs folding, families gathering for photos, voices calling out names, laughter rising in bursts. But none of it interrupted the stillness between them, and Marcus's gaze shifted briefly past Ethan, toward the direction of the bleachers, where the 6 men remained, now less distinct, within the moving crowd but still present, still noticeable to anyone who knew what to look for. And one of them met his glance, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning away, blending back into the flow without ceremony, without expectation. And Marcus returned his attention to Ethan, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if that moment had already settled into something permanent, something that did not need to be revisited. And Ethan followed his gaze briefly, catching a glimpse of the figures behind, the quiet presence that had shifted everything, and his expression flickered with curiosity, with questions that had not yet formed into words. But Marcus placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, grounding him back into the present, not to stop the questions, just to delay them, to keep this moment focused on what mattered most. And Ethan nodded again, understanding without explanation. And together, they turned slightly, moving with the crowd now, not pushed, not directed, just flowing naturally toward the exit, side by side. The diploma held between them like a shared weight, a shared achievement. And as they stepped off the edge of the field, the sunlight caught them both in the same frame, the same space, no longer separated by distance, by doubt, or by anything that could be taken away. And for the first time since the day began, there was nothing left to interrupt it, nothing left to question, only the quiet, undeniable truth of where they stood. And who they were to each other. They moved with the crowd slowly, not rushed by the flow, but carried gently within it. The sound of footsteps on concrete blending with distant laughter and scattered voices, calling out names. And Ethan adjusted his gown slightly as they reached the outer edge of the field, the fabric catching the breeze while his fingers tightened briefly around the diploma before relaxing again, as if reminding himself that this was real, that it was finally done. And Marcus walked beside him without speaking, his stride steady, his presence grounded, allowing the silence between them to exist without needing to fill it. Because some moments were not meant to be explained, they were meant to be felt. And the parking lot stretched ahead, rows of cars reflecting the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, families gathering near trunks and tailgates, phones raised for pictures, voices overlapping in celebration. But Ethan slowed slightly, his steps losing the rhythm of the crowd as something settled in his chest, something he had not yet said. And Marcus noticed it immediately, not by looking, but by feeling the shift beside him, the subtle change in pace, the quiet hesitation that did not match the movement around them. And he turned his head just enough, not interrupting, not pressing, just making space for whatever needed to come next. And Ethan let out a breath, longer this time, heavier, his eyes dropping briefly to the diploma before lifting again. "I saw them," he said quietly, not looking at Marcus yet, his voice thoughtful, still piecing together the moment. "The men back there." And Marcus nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, not confirming, not explaining, just allowing the statement to exist. And Ethan continued, his tone steady but carrying curiosity. "They knew you," he added, the words not a question but close enough to one. And Marcus's gaze moved forward again, the sunlight reflecting faintly off the edge of his metal. And for a moment, he did not answer, not because he could not, but because the answer was not something that fit into a quick explanation, not something that belonged entirely to this day. And after a few steps, He spoke, his voice calm. Even, we served together, he said, the simplicity of it intentional, the weight behind it left unspoken but present all the same, and Ethan absorbed that, letting it settle, his mind. Filling in the spaces between those words, the years, the places, the moments that were never talked about but always there, shaping everything. And he nodded slowly, understanding not fully, but enough to know that what had happened back there was not random, not coincidence, but something rooted deeper than he had ever realized. And they walked a few more steps in silence, the sound of a camera shutter snapping nearby, a child laughing somewhere to their right, the normal world, continuing around them without pause. And then Ethan spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. They stepped in for you. And Marcus glanced at him briefly, a faint hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, not wide, not pronounced, just there. No, he said quietly, his tone steady, certain. They stood where they were supposed to. And Ethan looked at him then, really looked, the words settling into something clearer, something that shifted the way he saw the moment entirely. Not as rescue, not as intervention, but as alignment, as something that corrected itself when it needed to. And he nodded again, this time with more certainty, and they reached Marcus's truck parked near the edge of the lot, the metal warm from the sun, the reflection of the sky faintly visible across the windshield. And Marcus paused for a second, his hand resting on the door handle, not opening it yet, just standing there as Ethan turned to face him fully, the diploma still in his hand, the weight of the day settling into something quieter now, something lasting. And Marcus looked at him, his expression calm, steady, carrying a quiet pride that did not need to be spoken aloud. And in that moment, nothing else needed to be said, because everything that mattered had already been shown, already been understood, already been claimed without needing permission. Marcus did not open the truck door right away, his hand resting on the handle as if the moment needed one last breath before it moved forward. And Ethan stood across from him, the diploma held loosely now, no longer something to grip tightly, but something that belonged to him fully, something that would not slip away. And the sunlight stretched across the parking lot in long, golden lines, reflecting softly off the windshield, catching the edges of Marcus's metal in a quiet glow that did not demand attention, but carried weight all the same. And for a second, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything important had already settled between them in a way words could not improve. And Ethan shifted his weight slightly, glancing back toward the field in the distance, where the last of the crowd was beginning to thin, the blue gowns now scattered instead of gathered, the ceremony dissolving into memory piece by piece. And when he looked forward again, his expression had changed, not dramatically, just enough, a quiet clarity in his eyes that had not been there before. You almost walked away, he said, his voice calm, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what he had seen, what he had felt from a distance. And Marcus held his gaze, steady as ever, considering the words, without rushing to answer. And after a moment, he gave a small nod, not in agreement with the outcome, but with the truth of the moment. I was ready to, he said simply, his tone even, grounded. And Ethan's brow shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in realization, the weight of that answer settling deeper than expected. Why? He asked, softer now. And Marcus's eyes moved briefly past him, not to avoid the question, but to gather the answer in a way that stayed honest. Because your moment mattered more than mine, he said, each word deliberate, unforced, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else that had been said all day. And Ethan looked down for a second, the edge of the diploma brushing against his hand, his fingers tightening just slightly before easing again. And when he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, something deeper than pride, something closer to understanding. And he nodded once, slow, certain. You did not miss it, he said quietly, his voice carrying a steadiness that mirrored Marcus's own. You were always part of it. And Marcus's expression did not change much, but there was a subtle shift, a quiet softening around the edges, like something inside him had settled into place, something that did not need to be said out loud to be real. And he opened the truck door then. Finally, the metal giving a soft click, the moment moving forward without losing anything it had carried. And Ethan stepped around to the other side, placing the diploma carefully on the seat before sliding in, the fabric of his gown settling with a soft rustle. And Marcus paused for just a second before getting in, his hand brushing lightly against the metal once more, not out of habit this time, but acknowledgement. And as he sat down and closed the door, the outside noise softened instantly, replaced by the quiet interior, the faint hum of the cooling air, the distant sounds of the crowd now muted. And for a moment, they just sat there, side by side, the weight of the day settling into something still, something complete. And Marcus turned the key, the engine coming to life with a low, steady sound. And as they pulled out of the parking lot, the field behind them grew smaller in the rearview mirror, the rows of chairs, the stage, the crowd, all fading into distance, but not into loss, into memory, something carried forward, something that would not need to be revisited to remain true. And Ethan glanced once more at his father, then out the window, the sunlight shifting across his face as the truck moved forward, and neither of them spoke again. Not because the story had ended, but because it had finally found its place, quiet, steady, and undeniable, exactly where it was meant to be.